Okie dokie. So this season, the meta has been kind of interesting, where Prot Paladin and Vengeance Demon Hunter have been pretty good, which is twice as many tanks as we normally see. No, it's normally just one. 3 healers have been pretty good with Resto Druid, Disc, and Mistweaver Monk. And then DPS meta has been Havoc X. And so the X has actually been kind of flexible, whether it be Demonology Warlock, Fire Mage, Frost Mage. Bouncer has been pretty good. Rogue is also fairly solid. I think Enhancement Shaman's also low-key pretty good. But like the third slot is mostly up in the air. You can kind of play whatever you want. And so now we've actually seen some tuning. And Blizzard, whenever they tune specs, they tune based around Mythic Plus, they tune around PvP, they tune around rate. And what they stated is, after closely monitoring data on class performance as well as player feedback, we've developed the following adjustments to classes that are over and underperforming in group content and PvP. These changes will go into effect with the scheduled weekly maintenance on the region. And so you can probably tell by the title, there's something to do with Mage and God comp here. So I'm going to skip immediately to Mage, and then we'll kind of circle back to all the other stuff. So probably the most ridiculous change in this whole entire thing is the overbuffing of both Fire and Frost Mage, specifically for Mythic Plus. Now, I have a belief in, like, let's actually talk through what the changes are. Arcane Blast damage increased by 6%. Arcane Missiles damage increased by 10%. Arcane was good in Mythic Plus, and it was, like, fine in raid. I mean, if you look at statistics, Arcane's the best performing mage spec. It was about average. It got a slight buff. A lot of the casters got a slight buff. This is not super surprising. Fire Mage, but this spec also wasn't really seen in Mythic Plus, even though it was probably okay. Fire Mage was seen in Mythic Plus and was quite strong in Mythic Plus, but quite bad in Raid. And now they have Fire Blast damage increased by 12%, Pyroblast damage increased by 5%, Fireball damage increased by 10%, Flame Strike, an AoE ability, damage increased by 12%, and Intensifying Flame now increases Ignite damage by 25%, which was previously 15%. And so whenever you look at Fire Mage, you're like, oh yeah, they sucked in Raid. It makes sense. And for Frostbolt damage increased by 15%, Ice Lance damage increased by 12%, Flurry damage increased by 10%, and GS damage increased by 6%. And you look at Frost and you're like, wow, that spec sucked in Raid. And so it makes sense, right? Whenever you're like, oh yeah, they typically tune based off of Warcraft logs data. This is, I feel like if you played in Sepulchre 9.3, whenever they buffed Destra Warlock, I feel like I'm just watching the same thing happen again. Where if you then swap to Mythic Plus, and there was some actually AoE buffs, Fire Mage got Flame Strike damage increased. If you swap then to Mythic Plus, Frost Mage, Fire Mage, what does it say? You fan. Frost Mage, Fire Mage, Frost Mage, Fire Mage, Fire Mage, Fire Mage, Fire Mage, Fire Mage, Fire Mage. But you're getting both Frost and Fire, literally Frost Mage. It's just like Frost Mage, Frost Mage, Frost Mage, Frost Mage. So, I don't know. 80% of the comps on the first page of Raider.io have a mage involved. And if you swap to, what they're doing with the spec tier list, like a data-driven site like Subcreation, and you're looking at what's going on in Mythic Plus, ranged, it has Augmentation Evoker, then it has Fire and Frost, both pretty highly ranked. Definitely higher than they should be to be receiving buffs from Mythic Plus. And if you look at Dratnos and I make a tier list for Wowhead for Mythic Plus. We have both Fire and Frost in A, which we have described as solid third DPS slot options. Havoc and Og were certainly in the first DPS slot, and this is a problem. I don't know what they're doing with Fire and Frost. I understand that they're trying to buff relative for Raid, but they gotta. All right, go back. We gotta hit the rewind on this one, because they have just buffed Mage into being the only spec that you're likely to see in like the third DPS slot option, where there were already 2 slots that were previously locked up by Havoc Demon Hunter and Augmentation Evoker, and now it might be a situation where the third slot is completely locked up due to Mage. And there's a lot of tweets that were incredibly critical, such as this tweet from Yoda that it says adjust to Mythic Plus tier list, and it says Blizzard's favorite, weird but okay, and then specs that buff the Mage. And keeps the buffers alive. Mage can't die anyways, and then it's Lamau, which kind of seems correct. I don't know. Whenever I was looking at this, I knew that I needed to make a video because holy shit, the mage buffs are insane. How this is probably going to impact the meta is, and we're going to talk about some of the other specs, is it's going to be a mage locked in for the third slot. I don't think Havoc's going to get pushed out. I think but I could see a world where maybe it's Demo Lock Mage Aug, but I think that that's less likely. I think it's still probably going to be like Havoc plus Mage, and probably Fire even. So let's talk through the other class tuning, because there's actually a lot of class tuning, but the Mage one needed 5 minutes of ranting. I am sorry. So Havoc got a little bit of a nerf. The Sigil Flame damage, this was reduced for all Demon Hunters, both Havoc and Vengeance. Doesn't really affect Vengeance too much. Havoc, so I was talking to the Wowhead guide writer for Havoc, and he was saying that this probably equates to about a 4% damage nerf on AoE, about a 1% damage nerf on single target. Again, these aren't final numbers. He said these are about, he's just eyeballing it. This is like napkin math kind of thing. Havoc is quite good. Havoc is still quite good. They can't die realistically in a lot of Mythic Plus runs. They are, depending on what you're playing against, kind of non-competitive damage-wise. I think that there are a couple specializations that can keep up in a few dungeons. I think Fire and Rise is one that can keep up with Havoc Demon Hunter occasionally. I think that Demonology Warlock in some instances actually can keep up and potentially even beat a Havoc Demon Hunter in some spots. But in general, Havoc has been the shining star of the season. Definitely one of the best specializations. Is getting a 4% damage nerf on AoE. And they were also incredibly good in Raid. So makes sense. Funnily enough, you actually see it all through rogue specs at the very top. But yeah, so they hit the Rage Fire, they hit Collective Anguish, they hit a Fire with the MO Aura reset proc thing, nerfed it down a little bit. Realistically, I don't think that this changes too much of the texture for what Havoc is doing. And I think that with class tuning, especially during the season, Blizzard likes to take light touches with what they do for specializations to make sure that people don't feel like their relative placement of specializations changes too much. It makes sense that they want to kind of nerf Havoc to try to bring it in line with other specializations, but they don't want to take a hammer to it, especially since like it's good in Mythic Plus, and it's one of the best specs in Mythic Plus that we've seen maybe in a while, but it's not outside of the realm of balance, and they need to bring it down a little bit, but not an insane amount. And I think that the damage types that they're hitting, it being mostly aimed at AoE, makes sense. I think Dev, it has the problem of where it is completely overshadowed by augmentation, generally speaking. They do have pretty good damage profiles for, I think, some of the later bosses. I want to say Tendril's like pretty good on a 2-minute timer with Dragon Rage and whatnot. They're also buffing their single target damage from like a meta game level. I don't think this really changes Dev's position. I think that these are things that are nice if you were already playing Devastation. Slight buff on Prez. Prez was a spec that I think was looked at as it's going to be quite good in Raid this tier, and actually have some of the highest HPS checks or HPS throughput. It's been a little bit worse than that. A lot of that's actually fight design, but also it seems like the throughput's a little bit lower, and so Blizzard's like, oh yeah, we're gonna get Resonating Spear applying Echo, which will allow people to get healed a bit better. Mage, again, we already talked about Mage. For Raid, it makes sense. It makes sense if you're looking at it only in the perspective of Raid. For Mythic Plus, it absolutely makes no sense. I hate it. Terrible change. Please go back. Please undo. We're gonna Control Z on this one. That one's not it. Windwalker Monk needed God, and somehow they found him. It was a lot of buffs. Basically, we feel like they need a second incremental improvement for the relative performance. This round of tuning focuses on payoff, successfully executing the bonus effects of the current tier set, as well as increasing the damage of rotational Chi Spenders and Rising Sun Kick and Fist of Fury. It makes sense. I think that Babylonia said it was about a 6% damage increase. I'm not 100% sure on the numbers on that, but I would definitely go and check the Monk Discord. This is a spec that, if you look at melee tier list on subcreation in regards to relative performance, it was in D tier, it was near the bottom, it wasn't being played. If you look at it in raid performance, it was near the bottom. If you look at just, like a tier list that Dratnus and I made, it was near the bottom. It was not performing super hot in any level of content, so it makes sense. Red Paladin. I would describe Red Paladin as not that bad in Mythic Plus, not that great in Mythic Plus, but not that bad. It's okay. Not great in Raid, especially in such a melee-friendly tier. They're quite bad in Raid. Near the bottom with all these other specs, and it's pretty clear at this point that Blizzard, whenever they're buffing specs, they go, yeah, so what are the bottom 8 specs on Warcraft logs, and then they go into them. I think that this is a pretty consistent thing that we've seen tier over tier. Yeah. For Priest, Shadow actually getting a slight AoE buff, where Psychic Link was, whenever God Comp was relevant last season, Psychic Link got nerfed from 25% to 15%, and now is being rebuffed back up to 15% or to 25%. And now The issue with Shadow and Mythic Plus, and the reason that it's probably still shitty, this doesn't actually change anything, but it's nice if you're already playing Shadow. And the reason it's still shitty is because Shadow had a good tier set last year, and they gutted the utility of Shadow, and so now they have a single target focused tier set, which, you know, it's more raid driven. It's still not great, but it's more raid driven, and their AoE is bad because it got nerfed like 6 times consecutively whenever God Comp was a thing. And so now Shadow's in a spot where it's really bad. And funnily enough, it gets out-simmed by Vengeance Demon Hunter. Just a nice tidbit for you there. On AoE, it gets out-simmed by Vengeance Demon Hunter. Not on single target, but on AoE, it gets out-simmed by Vengeance Demon Hunter, which is troll. Holy Priest, all healing increased by 3%. Prayer Mending healing increased by 15%. This is a spec that actually does a lot of damage in Mythic Plus. I don't know how it fares in Raid. I know people are playing it for Frack, for Guardian Spirit. It's actually... I think that, like, you know, these are very light touches. I don't think you're ever hooting and hollering over a 3% buff. Kind of same thing with the Ret Paladin. These aren't functionally changing anything. These are maybe minor changes these are minor changes overall. These are changes that you never notice at all. I don't think they're noticeable ever in any form or fashion. Same with the Assassination Rogue nerfs. All ability and melee auto attack damage reduced by 3% does not apply in PvP. It's actually interesting that they hit the auto attack damage for Assassination Rogue, whereas they didn't hit the auto attack damage for Ret Paladin, so Ret Paladin only got a 2.5% damage increase, where Assassination Rogue got an actual 3% decrease. Elemental, earthquake damage increased by 50%. That is an insane number, by the way, 50% on earthquake. Enhancement, elemental warding now reduces magic damage taken by 3 to 6%, was previously 2-4. That's not bad. I think developer note, this is aimed at improving enhancement shaman survivability in all content. No shit. That's why you buff their passive nodes. Passive nodes are actually some of the most important things for survivability of a specialization, just broadly speaking. And so you've seen like the passive nodes. I think like Veteran of the Third War for DK is probably the best one. Sanctified Plate's also probably one of the best ones. And so these passive nodes, you saw Dev Evoker get buffed last week, and now you're seeing Enhancement Shaman getting buffed this week. It makes sense that they're trying to curb defensive creep a little bit. Some specs are stupid this season. I think that I'm probably going to make a video talking about defensive creep just in the game in general, and talk about how far we've come with some specs being somehow tankier than actual tanks as a DPS, but that's not for the purposes of this video. Restoration Shaman, Torrent now increases the initial heal of Riptide. Healing Surge increased by 12%. Healing Stream Totem increased by 12%. I'm going to be honest with you. I'm not really sure what this does. I know that Resto Shaman's actually quite good. I know that I play with him in Mythic Plus. One of the healers that I play with, he mains Resto Shaman, so we've been playing with that a lot. From my perspective, I thought they were fine. And so, but they're getting a buff. They're getting a throughput healing increase even. I'm not going to complain. I'm going to get healed more. This is great. And then Warlock buffs. Af and Destro were both really shitty for 5-man content. I'm not exactly sure how they were in Raid. I mean, you can speculate, right? Like, it doesn't look like they were doing great, but they were really, really shitty in 5-man content. So it makes sense that they're targeting Rain of Fire. Cataclysm is mostly a single target spell. Immolation damage, Immolation from Infernal and Blasphemy. These are mostly AoE focused buffs. So Seed of Corruption, Soul Rot, Rain of Fire. It makes sense that they're looking to kind of buff those things. But yeah, I mean, those are overall all the changes. Again, I cannot believe that they're buffing Mage, especially with how good they are in Mythic Plus, and it makes me question whether or not they should actually have different tuning knobs for Mythic Plus and Raid. I feel like I'm back with the Destro Warlock 6% aura buff whenever Destro Warlock was the best, like, they were the best Mythic Plus spec in the game. They were decently below average in Raid at that time because most people weren't playing them. And then they got hit with a 6% buff, and then you just sit there and left with like, what? Like, how does that even happen? And especially at the scope of these changes that they're doing to Fire, I think this takes it from a spec that was already a solid third DPS option to being locked in as a third DPS option. Anyways, that's it. I'll be back tomorrow. I'm probably going to be talking about something else, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.